Our guest speaker tonight is of and about the theme of this event, Dreamers and Dragons. He is the co-founder and current president of one of the largest science fiction, fantasy, gaming, comics, and pop culture conventions in the world, DragonCon, out of Atlanta, Georgia. A self-described geek, he enjoys reading both science fiction and fantasy, and passionately speaks of the value of comics and games to turn our youth into readers, and through that, inspire them to dress up in imaginable and unimaginable character costumes for the annual DragonCon parade. He is, in short, a perfectly normal human being who loves magic, monsters, aliens, dinosaurs, and dragons. To tell you his story and give you your Dragon 101, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Pat Henry.
Thank you very much. Let's establish one thing at the outset of my talk. I believe in dragons. This is quite a spectacular event, recognizing talented, aspiring writers and artists of science fiction and fantasy from all over the world. There's an unbiased competition that takes place for you participants to get here, and your work is then judged by an esteemed group of judges who give a lot of their time to pay it forward and make you and our industry better. Given no guarantee of return, Writers and Illustrators of the Future is endowed in perpetuity by L. Ron Hubbard. This is quite a gift that's been given to our industry and to our world. As a person who makes a living promoting fantasy and a person who enjoys reading fantasy, thank you, Mr. Hubbard, thank you, administrators, and thank you, judges. Fantasy began as oral tales of historic deeds and tragic romances, ghost stories, and fantastic voyages. In the Middle Ages, romance and fairy tales began to enter the genre. Historically, most works of fantasy were written pieces of literature. Fantasy literature as a distinct type emerged during Victorian times with the works of such writers as Mary Shelley, William Morris, and George MacDonald. In more modern times, J.R.R. Tolkien played a large role in popularizing the fantasy genre with his publications, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Today, fantasy continues as an expansive medium encompassing many subgenres of literature, epic fantasy and sword and sorcery, to urban fantasy, magical realism, fairy tale fantasy, dark fantasy, and many more. Fantasy has been distinguished from other forms of literature by its style and its freedom of expression, wherein an author has the ability to use any storytelling element to strengthen the narrative, whether it be dragons, magic, or castles. Authors often engage in creating an entire world against which the narrative plays out. L. Ron Hubbard noted, "Science fiction, to be credible, has to be based in some degree on plausibility. Fantasy gives you no limits at all. This doesn't say one is better than the other. They are simply very different genres from a professional viewpoint." So at last, dragons come into the conversation. Are they fantasy or are they real? It is claimed that dragons appeared in prehistoric cave art dating back 20,000 years. Dragons were first introduced in written word in approximately 2500 BC in an Akkadian poem that is considered the first great work of literature. The dragon is one of the oldest characters in the Epic of Gilgamesh and earlier Sumerian poems. Dragons are almost universal throughout the world's ancient cultures: Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Aztec, Egyptian, Babylonian, Norse, and Chinese. Early dragons differ by region. Dragons from Asia are long and snake-like. From India, they have deer horns and multiple heads. Slavic dragons are again snake-like with multiple horns, and their heads grow back unless you cut them all off. Now, Ethiopian dragons eat elephants and can grow to 180 feet long. European dragons live in rivers and caves, have armored hides and wings, though they rarely fly. Dragons have been battled by such notables as Gilgamesh, Sigurd, Beowulf, Siegfried, Hercules, Perseus, and St. George. A couple of these characters are historic fact. Others, probably not. There are a variety of dragons, too. Some named, some unnamed. The most famous include Tiamat, Smog, Leviathan, Elliot, Fafnir, King Ghidra, Puff, and of course my granddaughter's favorite, Toothless. Evidence that dragons are real is interesting and fun, but admittedly a little bit weak. The dragon is in fact fantasy. In fact, it's been said that the dragon is the very emblem of fantasy. After all, who could believe in a creature that spews fire or an acid, and one type's blood can kill and another type's blood gives invulnerability? They come in many colors of the rainbow, including metallic. Most are greedy, some are vain, most tell lies, but some tell jokes. In 1974, dragons were heavily and no doubt scientifically researched and specifically categorized by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Information was cataloged in the Monster Manual, which incidentally was typed and edited from handwritten text by your new Writers of the Future Judge, Jody Lynn Nye. Beautiful renderings were done of all these fantastic creatures, writers and illustrators working together, collaborating, sometimes the illustrators taking the lead, sometimes the writer. And some of these writers and illustrators are here tonight, right, Larry? Larry Elmore? All dragons have the choice of being good or evil, but there are some general tendencies based on type reflecting our own human nature. Red dragons are the Gordon geckos of the dragon world. They are greedy, covetous, fiercely territorial, and obsessed with increasing their treasure hoard. They are vain, cunning, and terrible. A red dragon can be identified by its 2 wings and 2 long horns. They prefer to eat meat, especially people, and they breathe fire. Black dragons are the mother-in-laws of the dragon world. They are vile, evil-tempered, and obsessed with death. They are abusive, quick to anger, and malevolent. She prefers surprise attacks versus fair fighting and can be identified by her grim skeletal appearance. She breathes poisonous, sizzling acid. Blue dragons are pensive and vain, preferring to attack people in ambush. A blue dragon can be identified by his frilled ears and a single horn upon his head. His eyes are glossy and without pupils. Blue dragons breathe lightning. Green dragons are belligerent creatures and masters of intrigue, politics, and backbiting. They are cruel, they are liars, and discourse with them can lead to your disaster. Green dragons breathe toxic chlorine gas. White dragons, also called ice dragons, are remarkably bestial, preferring frozen food. They bury their prey in snowbanks for days before consuming it. Purple dragons, also known as deep dragons, are possibly the least well-known of the chromatic dragon family. They live deeper in the earth than most human folk ever go. Gray dragons, or storm dragons, are masters of the skies. They are excellent flyers and only land to rest or eat. In addition, they have full control of the weather and will attack any human that bothers them, conjuring strong winds and dangerous lightning. Metallic dragons in modern fantasy, brass, bronze, copper, gold, and silver, are generally good, unlike chromatic dragons, which are generally evil. All metallic dragons have dull scales at birth and become shinier with aging. And finally, space dragons. Space dragons are hybrids, a mix of science fiction and fantasy. They have rocket packs or spaceships because wings just don't really work that well in the void of space. Most are smaller than their Earth counterparts simply because there's not a lot to eat in outer space. In 1986, most conventions focused on one genre. There were comic book conventions, science fiction conventions, gaming conventions, and Star Trek conventions. At the time, 7 of us convention nerds with very diverse interests got together to model a convention with our own unique style. Our first show had Michael Moorcock, Gary Gygax, Eric Bloom, and Richard Garriott. Quite a diverse convention. Diverse like dragons. We needed to be big like most dragons to afford our aspirations. Dragons are not only in literary fantasy, but they're in science fiction, games, TV, cosplay, movies, and comic books. What a great name for a convention. Let's call it Dragon Con. In 1989, guest of honor, the late Anne McCaffrey, a past Writers of the Future judge and SIFWA Grandmaster, came to the show, making Pern as well as other fantasy literature an established part of our convention. Today we have 8 literary tracks, 5 additional tracks that cross over into literature, along with all those great classic science fiction convention traditions. Over half of the judges here for Writers and Illustrators of the Future have been guests at our show, and many come back every year. We also have a number of past contest winners who take an active role in running our conference. Award programs like this are an integral part of the creative workspace. They help artists of all sorts elevate their game and reach for the fantastic, and work hard to be recognized for what they continually give so much of their passion and life to create. In fact, we believe so much in the importance of the awards programs that we started the Dragon Con Awards this past year. They are an unbiased People's Choice Awards with 11 categories, 7 of which are literature. Like the Dragon, our recipients are extraordinary and unique. Just as movies helped us through the Depression, comics through the Second World War, and music through the Vietnam era, we need science fiction and fantasy today to help us through today's uncertain times, to help us reshape and redefine the world in which we live. The demand for these genres has never been greater. The market has never been better. Today, written words and illustrations of speculative fiction fuel not only the literary world, but also feed the television industry, the movie industry, video games, cosplay, and music. Good fantasy is magic. It transports the reader to a new and different reality, and they come back changed forever. We want to become absorbed in your fantasy. We want you to make us believe. You have the talent, and now you have the tools. Go and make us proud. Thank you, Writers and Illustrators of the Future. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for everything you do to carry L. Ron Hubbard's vision to promote and improve this great industry.